Let me show you the data that I look at to determine whether or not we're currently high or low in the Bitcoin price. I sold Bitcoin one day after the all-time high, and I'm now looking at the exact same data, on-chain data, to determine whether or not we're going to further rise from here or fall from here. So this is the mistake a lot of people do. They simply just look at price data, draw random lines on charts, try to estimate where a support or a resistance might be. But the problem is, the real secret, I believe, is in on-chain data. It's at looking at who is buying, who's selling, are the long-term holders holding, are the long-term holders selling, are the short-term speculators currently manipulating. Let's have a look at all of this. So what we see over here is the Bitcoin price in the last few months, and what we see here as the vertical line is when I sold a lot of my Bitcoin. So I accumulated very heavily in the 20K region, so around here, and I sold a lot one day after the all-time high. Now, why over here? It's because of the data that I'm going to show you in this video, and this data is 100% free, so you can simply just follow the exact same charts going forward. So have a look at chart number 1, the Bitcoin unrealized profit and loss. And note, whenever we are pretty high on this chart, we tend to also lose a lot of momentum in Bitcoin. So a lot of unrealized profit relative to the loss. So that's a ratio here. Whenever this peaks, we tend to not rally that much anymore. And have a look at this. This peaked again on the 13th of March 2024. That was exactly the all-time high. So this is no coincidence, right? This doesn't peak that often. I don't like when people invest heavily in Bitcoin and try to time the cycles and they ignore data like this. It's not a perfect indicator by no means, but it's definitely helpful. Whenever the unrealized profit relative to the loss is high, you want to be careful. You want to offload at least partially. Now let's segregate the unrealized profit from the unrealized loss, because there are actually different indications for potential lows and highs in the price. Whenever there's a lot of unrealized profit, then people might take some of that profit, right? When you are 200% in profit with a large Bitcoin position, you might consider selling some of that Bitcoin and move this maybe to stocks, maybe to bonds, maybe to precious metals, or simply just to cash, or you might even buy a property or pay the down payment for a property. So whenever you have an initial allocation to Bitcoin, say 10 or 20%, and that suddenly triples, now you've got so much exposure to Bitcoin that you probably want to balance this out. So that's over here. That's the realized profit. So this is when people actually sell. Not when this is unrealized, but when people actually make the transaction. So here it's peaking on the 16th of March. So 3 days after the unrealized profit peaked. So that drop over here was simply people taking profit. But let's have a look at the exact opposite of that, the realized loss. So when are people scared? When are they locking in losses because they think it might fall further? Whenever this peaks compared to historical levels, we tend to be at maximum depression. It peaked on the 25th of May. It also peaked on the 19th of June, 2021. And afterwards, we had another rally. Right? We went up another 100% from this dip. Then we've got another peak in the realized loss on the 20th of June 2022. Another such peak on the 16th of November 2022. And can you see this? After those peaks, we tended not to fall that much anymore. Those are good buying opportunities. When people are giving up, you want to consider buying. So when people realize their profit, you want to be out. When people realize their losses, you want to get in. Now, all of those charts can be found at checkonchain.com. So that's here in the background, right? Check on Chain. Simply search for checkonchain.com and feel free to also search for the title of the chart. You will get directly to this link. I've got the most important charts bookmarked myself, and I look at this every now and then, especially when there's a lot of price movements to the upside or to the downside. I want to know what those long-term holders are doing. I want to know if people realize profit or losses. Now, this is the realized profit and loss in US dollars. And we can see that when we go back in time, that those extensions weren't that large in the past because Bitcoin as a whole wasn't that big. Let's have a look at the exact same chart, but now in Bitcoin, not in US dollars. This tends to peak at very similar magnitudes. Especially the realized loss peaks are very nice to get potential entries when there's maximum capitulation, when potentially people also get forced liquidated, as in there is a crash and people have to sell their levered positions. That's when you want to get in. Now, we already talked about the realized and unrealized profit and losses. Let's now distinguish between the short-term holders and the long-term holders. Because especially when the long-term holders are moving, that's a very important sign. When the people that usually do not move their Bitcoin, when they suddenly do move their Bitcoin, when they suddenly sell and they're actually long-term investors, that's an alarm sign. Because when the diamond hands aren't that diamond anymore, when they turn into paper hands, we might want to be cautious as well. Let's look at the realized loss first. This is now measured in Bitcoin, and this is segregated by long-term holders, LTH, and short-term holders, STH. And of course, we do have our spikes whenever we tend to turn around in the price, but the short-term holders do generate a bit of noise. As in, we might be buying already here, we might be buying here. We did see a partial rally, but who knows who sold over here? Not a lot of people. And so we do get quite a lot of signals, which can be useful if you're dollar cost averaging in the market, as in you're buying in regularly, and buying whenever this peaks might make sense. But what I'm really interested in is the long-term holders. Let's just isolate those. See how the long-term holders didn't sell with this dip. They only sold here during the miner capitulation, when the miners also sold at the end of 2018. Look how they didn't sell that much during COVID, but how they did sell a ton after the FTX collapse, right? First we had the Terra Luna collapse, then we had the FTX collapse. And in both cases, when this spiked up a lot, this was the perfect time to buy. When long-term holders get scared, that's when you want to be in. In both cases, you made a multiple X return from 3K all the way to 60K, right? So a 20X, and here from 16K all the way above 70K, so a 4.5x roughly. There is of course diminishing returns. Currently prices are not going down, but once we do see the correction, I will look at this chart very, very closely. When the long-term holders panic, that's when I want to become an ultra long-term holder. That's when I want to pick up Bitcoin. Who would have bought the perfect bottom without that data? It's super, super hard. Not looking at the on-chain data is an absolute mistake. There's simply just too much gold hidden here. You can buy the perfect bottom in both cases, and you can sell close to the perfect top with the unrealized profit metric. And will this work in the future again? Maybe not as perfectly, but ignoring this altogether is a mistake. Put this into your bookmarks. It's really worth it. And so we had a look at the realized losses by the long-term holders and the short-term holders. Let's have a look at the realized profit by both. Let's see what signals we can get. So here we go. This is both realized profit for the long-term holders and realized profit for the short-term holders. This is now combined. Let's first just look at the short-term holders. And yes, of course, we do get multiple selling signals. And sometimes those selling signals are useful, but they don't mark turnarounds in the cycle. They mark local tops. So if you're trading more actively, if you want to time those local tops, this is the way to go. Look at the realized profit of short-term holders. Let's have a look at the realized profit of long-term holders. We've got a peak over here, which was a bit early. It was pretty hard to time this last rally. We had a lot of realized profit after the miner capitulation. Very interesting. So that's people that bought way before, over here probably. But we also had one peak at the beginning of 2021 and another peak just recently. And of course, we see the first and second week of March here again. So the prices over here. So what does it mean when we say that the long-term holders are in losses or in profit? We simply just look at what point in time, at what price did a long-term holder buy a coin? So at what point in time did the long-term holder get its Bitcoin? And then at what point in time does it move the Bitcoin again? So we can see on average for all the long-term holders, at what point in time, what's the average price of all the Bitcoin that are being held by the long-term holders. And thus, when we compare this to the current price, we can see are they in profit or in losses. So let's have a look at that realized price, the realized price of the long-term holders. When the long-term holders are in losses, this is a good time to dollar cost average in several times actually. So we had this in the beginning of 2015. We had this after the miner capitulation in 2018, 2019. And we also had this just recently in 2022 after the FTX collapse. What does this blue line tell us? It tells us where potentially might be a market bottom, or at least where we would get a very, very good deal on Bitcoin. And currently, unfortunately, this is very low. This is at 19K. So there's two ways to resolve this, right? Either we suddenly see a surprise crash in Bitcoin, a massive crash. Alternatively, in case the price goes up, we could see the long-term holder selling, and then this blue line would adjust itself and would go up again. similar to 2016, 2017. This line tells us that Bitcoin currently is not a steal, right? So it does not make sense to take on a loan against your house and take all of that money and put this into Bitcoin and bet the farm on Bitcoin. That's not currently the best strategy. It's only a potentially good idea whenever the price is below the realized long-term holder price. And so we can see how many of the long-term holders are actually in losses. So we don't just see that the long-term holders in general are in losses, but how much, like what's the percentage of the long-term holders that are in losses. And whenever this is roughly 40 to 50%, so half of the long-term holders, when they are in losses, it makes sense to buy. Currently, the long-term holders, of course, are all in profit, but it's simply just a good way to time entry point. What's also very interesting is to see simply how much of the supply is currently in long-term holders versus short-term holders' hands. So whenever this red area here expands, like over here in 2017, 2018, then a lot of the Bitcoin is in short-term holders' hands, and they might not hold that long anymore in case the price turns around, right? So long-term holders tend to create less volatility than short-term holders. Whenever the red area here is expanded, we might not rise that much anymore. Currently, we aren't that high. So there's 73% of all of Bitcoin in long-term holders' hands. That's relatively healthy. So yeah, let's continue tracking charts like this. I am, of course, also doing regular updates on this channel, so feel free to subscribe. A like would be very much appreciated as well. It helps the channel grow. One more thing, in case you've got Telegram and you haven't joined us yet, there is a free link down below. Looking very much forward to chatting with you in Telegram. See you over there.